Should the pastor get paid? Notice get paid is in quotations there, indicating a double entendre. One meaning of get paid being the receiving of just compensation or a salary. The other meaning having to do with making as much income as possible from books, DVDs, TV, what have you. Now, I'm making this video in response to several persons who have asked me the question about the issue of whether it's right or wrong for a pastor or an elder to receive a salary. So I'm going to deal with this question by giving you a biblical background, the historical background, bring up some related issues, and then get right to the question of whether or not it is right or wrong. So let's start with the biblical background. 3 passages I was able to find when I went to the scriptures that I felt were related to the issue. 1 Thessalonians 5. But we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction, that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Live in peace with one another. This passage is important because it shows the work of instruction or teaching as being work that is worthy of being respected and being maintained. 1 Timothy 5:17 says, the elders who rule well ought to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. This passage is important because it shows the work of preaching and teaching by elders as an endeavor being worthy of some sort of compensation. It doesn't say how much. It doesn't say the elder can demand it, but it says that the elder is worthy of it. 1 Corinthians 9:13 is another important passage, because in this passage the Apostle Paul makes this an argument for the elder receiving a living from the gospel. He bases that argument on a precedent set by the law of Moses. He says, do you not know those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar? So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. So Paul establishes a principle here that those who proclaim the gospel are to get their living. However, Paul goes on to make an additional point that while he believes he has this right, that he does not make full use of this right because he does not want the gospel to be hindered, and he does not want the congregation to be burdened. He goes on to, but even more than that, he says he is compelled to preach the gospel. So it doesn't make a difference whether he got paid or not. He would still have to do it. So then let's move on to the historical background. For the first 3 centuries, ministers were unsalaried. The Roman Emperor Constantine came along and instituted the practice of paying clergy from church funds and government treasuries. I believe he did that in the 3rd century, 3rd or 4th century, can't remember. Tithing as a practice to support the clergy was first advocated by Cyprian, a prolific Christian writer in the 3rd century. He was also a bishop. And the practice later began in the 4th century. I believe that's when Constantine began that. But it did not become widespread until the 8th century. So this is very important information to consider. It's well documented. I have the sources here for you. Now, some related issues to this topic. There's a very firmly held tradition, especially in American congregations, that the pastor receives a salary. That's just how it is. Another issue to consider is the Lord said, meaning some pastors believe that the Lord has called them to quit their jobs and to go into full-time ministry. And oftentimes this is present it to the congregation just like that, the Lord said. And those in the congregation are put in the difficult position of having to argue with the Lord. Okay? And another related issue is making a living versus profiting. This brings up questions as to, how much is too much? Does the pastor or elder have sufficient outside income potential to where they can make a living without being a burden to the congregation? Or do their outside earning income activities, hinder their ability to minister effectively to a congregation or in their community? These are things to consider. How the church's finances managed. That's an important thing to consider also. Is the pastor involved in the church's finances and in determining his or her own salary? That's something to consider. So then, let's just cut to the chase. Not just up one Negro. We want to know, is it right or wrong for clergy to get paid? Well, we've looked at the scriptures on that, and I am open to being corrected, but on this point, and that is, the Bible contains no expressly stated prohibition of compensation to an elder or pastor. I was not able to find that in Scripture. I was able to find, however, and we just read this, that those who labor well in preaching and teaching are worthy of compensation, some sort of compensation, and are entitled to a living from their labor in the gospel. I want to emphasize again, it doesn't say how much, it doesn't say that they can demand per se, and it doesn't say they're entitled to a lifestyle. It says they're entitled to a living. So then, from my perspective, the issues are, first of all, begin with what one's view is on church, tithing, and the role of the pastor. I'm talking about the person in the congregation who is struggling with this issue about, whether or not it's right or wrong. If they're in a church where a pastor is demanding a salary, or the pastor gets paid a certain type of salary. There are a lot of things that take place with respect to church, with respect to tithing and the role of pastor, that are unbiblical, meaning it's not supported by Scripture or it's against Scripture. So it's unbiblical doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but it's just something that every individual person has to go to the Scriptures and be convinced in their own mind about. Is this appropriate as it relates to how God's church is to operate, and so on. Okay. The other issue is whether or not the compensation is demanded or freely given. I think it's wrong for a pastor to quit his or her job and come to the congregation and say, the Lord's told us this, and place this burden on the congregation and place them in the position, basically forcing them to support them financially. I think the proper thing to do is to pray about this, approach the congregation and say, my wife and I have prayed. Our desire, we believe the leading of the Lord is for us to go into full-time ministry. We'd like you to pray with us about this, and if you believe it's the Lord's will, then we would like to have we have a family, and we have certain needs, and we would appreciate you all determining what is an appropriate salary or compensation that would allow us to minister and serve you effectively on a full-time basis. If the congregation agrees to do that, I don't see any problem with it. And another issue is whether or not that elder pastor is worthy of the compensation. Do they preach and teach sound doctrine? Do they effectively minister? Again, that's a determination made by the congregation. Finally, fruits of the Spirit. The fruits of the Spirit are modesty, contentment, and self-control. I do not believe it's appropriate for a pastor or elder to live in extravagance, to live in luxury, to take advantage of a congregation financially, to have multiple streams of income and making profits off the gospel through books and CDs and tapes. I think that is totally wrong. So that's my take on it. I think that, again, the compensation should be done willingly with the agreement of the congregation, and the lifestyle should be a modest one. I hope I've answered your questions. I've tried to come from Scripture, and thank you for your questions. Take care and God bless.